Hello. I'd like to take just a moment and visit with you about some specifics found in the Flight Operations Manual, more specifically paragraph 4.10.2b regarding wind shear. In recent studies, 2 out of every 3 wind shear events were related to convective storms. We'd like to take the time today to visit about those events which are not related to convective storms.
Captain Jim Healy joined SkyWest in 1986 in the maintenance department. In 1990, he became a first officer in the Metroliner and transitioned to the Brasilia in 1992. He has since upgraded to captain in the Brasilia. Captain Healy, you encountered severe turbulence on a flight to Jackson, Wyoming last year. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, on February 7th, 1999, we reported for a shift that was to do 2 round trips to Jackson Hole and then a overnight in Twin Falls. We took the first trip to Jackson Hole. It was a bumpy ride. The weather was marginal. We were in and out of the clouds. There were several buildups as a front was moving through the area. At 23,000 feet, we were not on top. We were doing some deviating and also flying through some clouds. We got to Jackson Hole. The weather was reported as approximately 300-foot overcast and 3 miles visibility. We shot the approach, broke out right at minimums. It was a very bumpy approach all the way down. The weather was forecast to improve, and based on that information that they had, they requested of us to return back to Jackson Hole. It was our decision whether to continue with the approach or not, or to do the approach, but their request was that we return to Jackson Hole on the basis that the weather was forecast to improve. 80 miles south of Jackson Hole, we started to monitor the weather in Jackson Hole, and in fact dispatch was correct that the weather had improved 6,500 broken and better than 10 miles visibility, and it remained at that until we actually shot the approach into Jackson Hole. They're reporting the weather conditions as 27 knots, gusts to 27 knots down the runway out of approximately 200 degrees with 6,500 foot broken. And 10 miles visibility. We monitored the AEOS all the way to Jackson Hole, approximately 5 to 10 miles south of the Jackson Hole VOR. We decided that we would like to go ahead and request the ILS for runway 18 into Jackson Hole, at which time Salt Lake Center reported that 15 to 20 minutes prior, a Gulfstream had reported severe turbulence at 15,000 and had diverted over to Idaho Falls. Doug and I discussed this. We discussed that a corporate pilot flying a Gulfstream with the kind of turbulence that we encountered on our last round trip into Jackson Hole could read that as severe turbulence. And also the fact that we had been up there 2 hours prior and knew that it was a very bumpy ride in, we had decided to continue. We discussed that if we had airspeed deviations of plus or minus 20 knots, 25 knots, that we would go missed and we would return back to Salt Lake City. Also briefed the flight attendant of the ride that it would be a bumpy ride into Jackson Hole and that she was to be seated at that time.
Once we were getting a little bit closer to Jackson Hole, Doug did call me and tell me that there was an aircraft that had reported severe turbulence ahead of us and that we were about to encounter that, and then that I should check my passengers and make sure I was seated. He then proceeded to make an announcement to the passengers that we were about to encounter severe turbulence and to make sure that their seatbelts were securely fastened. So I did a walkthrough and I checked the passengers, kind of tried to ease them, said, it'll be okay. And I sat down with my shoulder harnesses and my seatbelt.
And also that we would fly the approach at 140 knots, as we had picked up light rime ice. After we were cleared for the approach, we descended to 15,000. We were actually getting a very smooth ride. Doug commented on the fact that this was probably the smoothest ride we'd had up from Salt Lake City. Procedure turn, we descended down to 12,000. At Quirt, we were stabilized and set up in the landing configuration at gear down of flaps 2.5. Intercepted the glide slope just outside of Shaker, somewhere around 10,600 feet. We broke out of the base of the clouds, at which time Doug responded, runway in sight, approximately 10 o'clock. It's out your DV window. I informed Doug that was uncomfortable for me to fly that approach out my DV window, that I was back on instruments. And his reply was, Roger. At that, I came back inside, had noticed that my indicated airspeed had dropped from 140 to 130 and was dropping through 120 knots, at which time Doug called out airspeed 120 knots. My reply was, Roger, correcting, and I added more power. Doug called out 110 knots. I added more power, looked up at my torque, and noticed I had 85% torque. Doug said 100 knots. I said, we're going around. Asked for max power. Doug gave me max power, at which time we encountered the severe turbulence.
All of a sudden, we just hit this very strong turbulence, just up and down, up and down.
I cannot tell you exactly how low or what kind of descent rates we did get. It was to the point where as soon as we hit the turbulence, it kicked both of our EECs offline. So right off the bat, we started to get triple chimes with warnings. I do know for a fact, just before we encountered the turbulence, I glanced up at my fast-slow indicator due to the speeds that we were losing, and noticed that the needle was buried well into the red. I know that we got the shaker just before we encountered the turbulence, and I do not know whether we ever got the pusher or not. I know that it kicked off the autopilot. We had a triple chime with an autopilot, triple chime with the engine control, and as soon as we hit the turbulence, we were also receiving oil warnings with the triple chime. We called for max power, tried to get out of there the best we could, tried to maintain control of the airplane. At each time that we would try, I know both of us tried several times to cancel the warnings. Each time you would reach over to push the button to cancel the warnings, the button was just not there. Sometimes your finger would hit 8, 9 inches away from where the button was when you reached for it. We were being thrown around. We were a 13-ton feather. I've never experienced that kind of turbulence.
I had my shoulder harness on, my seat belt on, and I felt it wasn't enough. I had the lav. I was holding onto the lav with my foot. I was holding onto the main cabin door with my other foot. I felt I needed more than just what my harness and my seat belt were providing to me, and I just had to hold on. I just had my elbows locked, basically.
It was very difficult to try to maintain any type of positional awareness, to try to know where we were, other than the fact of every once in a while as the runway came past the windscreen, you'd be able to see the runway. We climbed up to 12,000 feet eventually, and at maximum power, let me step back one step. I requested maximum power. He gave me max power. It still wasn't enough, and I requested Doug to give us everything it has, and he pushed the power all the way to the stops. So along with the engine control, the oil, the autopilot warnings, we are now receiving T6 warnings too.
Then next thing I know, I just heard this loud noise, just horrible loud noise, and I could tell that they were trying to just take max power, try to get out of there as fast as they could, as quick as they could.
I remember glancing down at the MAP and seeing every light. It seemed as though every light, amber and red, was flashing, and almost as if somebody was doing a light system test on the system. Eventually we climbed up to 12,000, where we still were receiving moderate turbulence. That's where we were able to see the engine instruments good enough to pull the power back to get rid of our warnings, cancel the warnings, let the center know that we need to return to Salt Lake, let them know of our severe turbulence encounter, check with the passengers, the flight attendant, and clean up the problems with the QRH.
After a few minutes, Jim called me, and I was actually quite surprised how fast he did call me. And he asked if I was okay, if the passengers were okay. And I told him that I was fine, but I would like to check on a few people. I had noticed some people were pretty upset, and he said, well, we'll call you back in just a couple minutes. We want to make sure that we're pretty smooth, as much as we can be anyway. I did walk through. Everybody was very still, very quiet. It was like they were in shock. They were just sitting there very quiet. After that, I handed out a few more waters, then all of a sudden people started becoming sick, throwing up. A woman threw up on herself, on her sweater. Another woman threw up in the aisle. someone was complaining about their back, their lower back hurting, and it was kind of like the domino effect, was more people were getting sick, other people were getting sick. I ran out of 6 sacks, basically. I had to hand out thank you bags for people to throw up in.
We returned to Salt Lake, where medical assistance was waiting for the passengers in Salt Lake. We didn't transport any passengers. We had 4 passengers. When we called back to Amy out of 12,000 feet and asked her how the passengers were doing, Amy responded that she knew that there were 4 passengers that were having a very difficult time. The other 24 passengers were okay. They seemed to be okay, but she hadn't been able to get out of her seat yet to confirm that. When she felt safe enough, or she felt that the bumps had subsided enough, that she would take care of that. So about 5 minutes later, she called back and said we did have 4 passengers that were vomiting uncontrollably. Several passengers were very shaken up and requested medical assistance in Salt Lake City. So we requested that, and it was waiting for us when we got to Salt Lake.
What can you tell us about any cloud formations as you approached the area or during the event?
I know when we left Salt Lake City for our first round trip to Jackson Hole, it was still daylight, and that we could see a lot of buildups in the area. 24,000 feet, we were still not on top. We could see that we were not going to get on top with any altitudes that we could fly. So at that time, I could see the formations, we could see the buildups, and we knew there was weather in the area. For the second round trip to Jackson Hole, it was night, there was no moon, and there was buildups in the area reported. We were IMC the majority of the flight from Salt Lake City to Jackson Hole. As far as on the approach, any cloud formations, perhaps when we broke out, it was too dark. Under a solid overcast in Jackson Hole at night, we couldn't see any cloud formations at all.
What can you tell us about your maximum rate of descent?
I can't tell you from seeing it on the instruments or being able to take a time. It was so bumpy that your eyes could never fixate on an instrument. You could never see the instruments long enough to be able to see any kind of a descent rate. I can tell you since from the flight data recorder charts that maintenance was able to give to us that overall we lost about 1,000 to 1,500 feet, and it lasted approximately 35 seconds.
How about torque or temperatures?
From the flight data recorder, we saw that our torque had exceeded 147% for approximately 18 seconds. T6 had exceeded 974 degrees for approximately 18 seconds.
What was the total duration of the event?
From start to finish, the total duration had to be somewhere around 30 to 35 seconds. It seemed a lot longer.
Captain Healy, if you encountered this again, what would you do differently? What lessons can we learn?
I know I've learned a lot of lessons. The biggest lesson and most important lesson is that from now on, any severe turbulence encounter, I will take it at face value. I won't try to dissect it and try to figure out in my own mind or justify in my own mind why I should try this approach or enter that area. I'll take a severe turbulence report as a severe turbulence report. I do not need to subject myself, my crew, or my passengers to that kind of a ride. The second lesson I've learned is a great lesson. It's as a crew, we live together, we work hard together. Doug did a fantastic job. Amy did a fantastic job. Doug was very sharp, very quick with getting on the radio, letting the controllers know in Salt Lake that we were encountering severe turbulence, we needed higher. He was quick with helping me with checklists. He was a great guy to have in the right seat. His experiences had helped him a great deal to prepare for that. We are a team. As far as Amy goes in the back, there were times, even above the bells and whistles, that we could hear noises coming from the back, sometimes screams, sometimes other noises, but we know it was very uncomfortable and a very tense situation for Amy, and Amy handled it very professionally and did a great job.
I always clean up early. I'm always in my seat early when I know that there's a chance of winds, especially when I go to Jackson Hole. Pretty much Pocatello, Cedar City, when there's winds or I know that there's severe weather, I always make sure I'm cleaned up very early and in my seat. I'm very careful about that now.
Do you think mountain wave training would be helpful to line pilots?
Yes, especially in our system.
Captain Healy, it sounds like you and your crew did a fantastic job handling a very serious weather event. Thank you for sharing your story with us.
Thank you.
Captain Bill Hill, whose flying background dates back to 1962, started flying sailplanes in conjunction with powered aircraft. While attending Metro College in Denver, Colorado, he interned at the National Center for Atmospheric Research and assisted in an extensive research project on mountain wave. While in Albuquerque, he worked part-time for Massachusetts Institute of Technology in teaching controllers how to use a highly modified radar to identify and issue related information to pilots regarding microburst information. Bill, who has had his own sailplane since 1969, is a nationally seated competitor. He has over 3,500 hours of glider time and has flown over 100,000 miles in sailplanes in mountainous conditions. While living in the Denver area, Bill assisted Mr. Lou Feierabend in making of the time-lapsed photography of the mountain wave video you are about to see.
Air and water have basically the same properties. One of the large differences between the two, of course, is viscosity. But a rock in a fast-moving stream will create a flow that will make ripples downstream of the rock, and the air does basically the same thing when you have an obstruction like we do in Jackson Hole with the Grand Tetons on the ground and the tropopause above, which creates a constriction. So we have something akin to Bernoulli's principle in that as the air flows from west to east across the mountains, the velocity increases, even though the forecast winds may not indicate that that's really happening. And because of that, and the fact that there is really no place for the air to go, once it gets on the downwind side, we get a series of atmospheric waves. And in conjunction with those waves, we have different cloud formations at peak level and below, and sometimes a little above that. We have the rotocumulus. Above that, we have the lenticulars, which are very smooth and indicate that the airflow there is undisturbed. Whereas at peak level and below, the air, like the water in the stream, is very, very disturbed. And as we look at those clouds, we can clearly see that that's also the case. Ingredients for the mountain wave. Basically, we need the obstruction. We just talked about that, the mountains and the tropopause. We also need the winds at approximately a right angle to the mountain and at velocities of approximately 20 knots at peak level. We don't necessarily need clouds, and we have some video that will clearly show that. In any case, with the clouds, we're going to have a series of atmospheric waves that are readily identified by the presence of those clouds. One of the things that you want to keep in mind is when you have those ingredients, the mountains, the wind at a given velocity and increasing with altitude, of course. And a stable air mass helps that, but it's not necessary. It's not absolutely necessary to have that. The air mass can be somewhat unstable and you can still have mountain wave conditions. Not unlike the conditions that Jim encountered. He went from a cold front on the first flight up to Jackson to a stable air mass, which produced a mountain wave just by virtue of the velocity of the winds and the direction, which is a totally different animal altogether. In any case, we have the cumulus clouds, the rotor clouds that form at peak level. One of the things you'll note when looking at these cloud formations is that the clouds are aligned at right angles to the wind, unlike cumuliform clouds on a clear, sunny day that will form and blow downwind with the wind. That's the first major clue that this is mountain wave and not just fair weather cumulus we see. And of course, as the mountain wave time-lapse shows, these clouds are really very, very active and very disturbed. The air is roiling and boiling at a pretty good rate, and it produces a lot of turbulence. We have a video or a shot of a DC-8. The engine on which one of the engines was ripped off of this airplane along with the wingtip as a result of turbulence. And although we couldn't find it, there was an encounter with the wave with the B-52 back in the, I think probably the late 60s, south of Colorado Springs, down around the Pueblo area, a low altitude oil burner route. And this particular B-52 had the vertical stabilizer and rudder ripped off the airplane. They did manage to fly it back to Mountain Home using the engines for lateral control. In any case, the mountain wave can be pretty insidious and very powerful and produce vertical velocities well in excess of 40 miles an hour. Now we're talking winds blowing 40 miles an hour straight up and straight down in conjunction with winds that could be blowing horizontally 60, 70, 80, 90 knots as we get higher and higher in the atmosphere. Clouds. Clouds are not always necessary for mountain wave conditions to exist. We can have days when we have the wind direction, the velocity, and the obstruction, but the atmosphere is so dry that no clouds will exist to give you a clue as to the atmospheric conditions. And our time lapse will show that in that we have this very disturbed air coming across the Continental Divide. And these shots were taken in Boulder, Colorado, by the way, but it doesn't really matter where they're taken. The bottom line is you have the three ingredients necessary to produce mountain wave. But Under these conditions, we have very, very disturbed air, but no evidence of that existence except for the clues that are given by the wind direction and the velocity. And the turbulence, some of the old-timers say, well, don't worry about mountain wave, it'll stop before it gets to the ground. When you look at this film, you see that clearly that's not the case at all. The mountain wave will go right to the ground. And it also goes quite high. Mountain wave is known to exist above 60,000 feet, actually above the tropopause. So when it's working, it's working. Cap cloud. We have some great shots of the cap cloud, which can be fairly thin, maybe 500 feet thick. And it's an orographic situation where the air is cooled as it rises up the windward side of the mountain. Cloud is formed. It warms as it goes down the lee side of the mountain and dissipates. So the cap cloud is there. Then quite often out here there would be a gap between the cloud in the atmosphere and the first primary. That cap cloud can be quite thick. Some of the footage shows cap cloud that probably exceeds 4,000 feet in depth. And on the day that was shot, a Piper Aztec crashed in those particular conditions just west of Boulder up on the Continental Divide on the peak-to-peak highway as he attempted to climb above the mountain wave conditions. Well, when you stack a cap cloud 4,000 feet thick on top of a 12,000 foot mountain, that goes to show you there's not a lot of airspace left to play VFR, and that didn't work with this guy. So we have cap cloud, we have the rotor cloud, the primary, the first iteration of the mountain wave, that's the primary rotor. And above that, under the right circumstances, we can have the lenticular growing out of the top of the rotor cloud. Downwind of that we'll have the second iteration of the cloud formation, or the secondary, and then each subsequent iteration is called the tertiary. And it can go downstream for hundreds of miles. Obviously, the frequency remains the same. What changes is the amplitude. The closer you are to the mountain, the more intense the vertical velocities will be. So when you're going from west to east, of course, it's a little bit easier. I should say it's more difficult because you have two things working against you. You have a pretty good tailwind along with the vertical shears that will be associated with the mountain wave. And if you're close to the mountaintops, down around 12, 13, 14,000 feet, it can be very, very intense. On the other hand, if you're going from east to west, you're flying into the winds, at least you have a headwind and more time to deal and adjust to the updrafts and downdrafts. The cap cloud will be the first indication of the mountain wave as it comes across the top of the obstruction. The first rotor formation that we'll see in conjunction with the mountain wave will be the primary. That'll be the first line of rotor clouds you'll see. The next one, the second iteration, will be the secondary, and every subsequent iteration after that is a tertiary. During the course of Jim's discussion of what exactly he would do to escape any adverse conditions he would encounter, he mentioned parameters that would dictate the fact that he's going to make a missed approach, and one of those was variations in airspeed plus or minus 25 knots. If you should encounter that, and of course it's going to happen very rapidly, decreasing airspeed and an increasing amount of torque to compensate for it, if you're down around the 20 to 25 knot regime below the speed that you've determined as the bottom line, in Jim's case he used 140 knots, which sounds like a good speed, it's time to think about doing the escape maneuver. The closer you get to the ground, the more intense the turbulence will become, and in all likelihood the vertical velocities could also be somewhat stronger, although that's not always the case. But if you have the first indication that that's going to happen, it's time to get out of there. And the first thing you need to do is climb. So it's going to take whatever amount of power it's going to take to get you out of there. Ideally, you want to avoid over-torquing the engines, but by the same token, if that's what's going to take to keep you from stalling, you better go to maximum enthusiasm. So getting out of the conditions, climbing is the first thing you need to do as part of the escape maneuver, just as we're taught for the microburst. If you're in VMC conditions, daytime or a very moonlit night where you can see the clouds, at least you have some indication then of what you're encountering, and you'll have more of an awareness of where the wave is likely to be. But in the process of escaping and doing the climb, get back in touch with air traffic control. In Jackson, we know that at approximately 12,000 feet, they can see you on radar and consequently can give you a radar vector. Now, a right-angled turn away from the mountains will get you out of the mountain wave very quickly, because bear in mind that the vertical velocity, I should say the width of the descending air is approximately 2.5 miles wide. And exactly right beside that will be an area of rising air of the same dimension. So it's rising air, descending air, rising air, descending air. And this whole area takes up somewhere between 4 and 6 miles. So a 90-degree turn, once you have reached a safe altitude, will get you out of the conditions as quickly as anything. And perhaps at that point in time, it's a good idea to think about going somewhere else, an alternate or back to Salt Lake. One of the things we want to seriously consider, if there's some indication that mountain wave conditions exist. Of course, the bottom line is safety. So we want to be looking at PIREPs, SIGMETs, ARIMETs, forecast conditions, and anything else that gives us an idea of what we're going to be getting ourselves into. And based on that, we can make an informed decision as to whether this particular flight is appropriate or whether perhaps it's time to wait for a better time to go to Jackson Hole or any of the other airports that are served by SkyWest that have mountainous conditions that could produce this sort of thing. So rather than going down a litany of airports that might produce mountain wave, just keep in mind, if you have mountains around the airport, you've got the obstruction, you've got the wind velocity and direction, the ingredients perhaps are there for mountain wave. You want to be aware of it, and you want to look for the conditions we've talked about, the rotorcumulus, the lenticulars, or perhaps, if there are no clouds, again, the fact that you have the velocity and the direction which could produce the wave. Under VFR conditions leaving Jackson Hole, how might one use the mountain wave to your advantage? You know that, of course, after we take off and above 1,500 feet, we can reduce to climb power. More often than not, you may be inclined to leave climb power in a bit longer above that altitude simply because you want the best performance you can getting out of the valley. But bear in mind where there's an updraft along the leading edge of the primary and the secondary and the tertiaries, you might climb along the leading edge of that cloud and use that to your advantage when making a VFR departure out of the Jackson area, obviously with the appropriate cloud currents requirements. But you'll find that on a good mountain wave day, vertical velocities could exceed 1,500, 2,000 feet a minute, which will also get you up above and out of the turbulence more quickly. So I'm not attempting to teach you how to use a Brasilia like a sailplane, but it's something to keep in mind. You may want to kind of experiment with that just a little bit as you're making a VFR departure out of there under conditions where mountain wave exists. Here at the training department, we have available for your viewing pleasure a full 20 minutes of time-lapse video on the mountain wave. So feel free to come by and look at that at your convenience. It's pretty enlightening, and it's the unabridged version. Thank you for your time.